The last thing I expected to feel walking into my own father's retirement party was invisible. But that's exactly what happened. And somehow, that still wasn't the worst part of the night. I'd driven 4 hours from Camp Lejeune. Taken 2 days of leave I didn't really have. Pressed my dress blues the night before until the creases were sharp enough to cut glass. Not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone would notice, but because that's what you do. You show up right. You show up righty. You show up ready. The party was at a restaurant my stepmother had rented out for the occasion. One of those places with dark wood paneling and dim lighting and menus with no prices, the kind of place my father had always said was too fancy for regular people before he married her. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. I sat in my car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at the entrance. A paper banner above the door read, "Congratulations, she F. 32 years in the fire department." My father had earned that banner. I was proud of him for it. I want to be clear about that. I was genuinely proud. I just didn't know yet that the banner was the most acknowledgement I would get all night. Inside, the room was warm and loud. Round tables with white tablecloths, centerpieces with little fire truck figurines, maybe 60-70 people. Firefighters my father had worked with, neighbors, people from his church, my stepmother's enormous extended family taking up what felt like half the room. My brother spotted me first. He was standing near the bar with 2 of his friends holding a beer, wearing a sport coat that still had the store creased down the sleeves. He was 28. 3 years younger than me, and he had our father's same wide jaw and the easy, uncomplicated smile of a man who had never once been made to feel like a question mark in his own family. "You made it," he said. "Not you're here, or good to see you, just you made it." Like my arrival was a minor logistical surprise, I said I would, I told him. He nodded, already glancing back toward his friends. "Dad's over there. He'll be glad you came. He'll be glad you came." Like I was a neighbor who'd stopped by out of politeness. Not his daughter. Not the one who'd been trying to get a phone call returned for 6 weeks. I found my father near the back of the room, surrounded by a half circle of his old crew. He looked good. Tan from the spring. A little heavier than I remembered, happier than I'd seen him in years. When he saw me, he opened his arms and hugged me, the way fathers do at events when they want everyone to see them being fathers. It lasted about 3 seconds. "Sweetheart, you remember Mike and Danny, right? These guys," and then he was already pivoting, already pulling me into the orbit of men who were not me, and I became a brief parenthesis in a story about a fire call from 2009. I smiled. I shook hands. I said the right things. My stepmother found me about 10 minutes later. She was wearing a cream blazer, and the particular expression she reserved for me, a kind of polished, arm's-length warmth that was technically welcoming and communicated nothing. She kissed the air near my cheek. "So glad you could come all this way," she said. "You look." She glanced at my uniform and something moved behind her eyes that she quickly covered with a smile, formal. "It's dress blues," I said. "Of course." She touched my arm once, briefly, like checking a temperature. "Your seat is over there, next to Patricia's mother. She's been dying to meet more of the family." I found the table. It was the one closest to the kitchen door, the one that swung open every 4 minutes, releasing a blast of hot air and the sound of clattering plates. Patricia's mother was 81 and hard of hearing and spent the first 20 minutes asking me if I was the one who did the flower arrangements. I said no. She asked again, differently, and I said no again. I looked across the room at the tables near the center, near my father. My brother had been seated there with 2 of his friends, even though they weren't family. A few of my stepmother's nieces and nephews I'd never met had the next table over. There was a whole cluster of my father's former colleagues, men who'd retired years ago, seated closer to him than I was. I was his daughter, his only daughter. I'd served 11 years in the Marine Corps, done 2 overseas deployments, earned a commendation I couldn't talk about in a room full of civilians, and I was seated at the kitchen table next to a woman who kept asking about flowers. I got up twice to get drinks. I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. At some point, my stepmother gave a toast. She talked about my father's dedication, his service, the way he showed up for his family and his community. She used the word family 4 times. She did not look at me once. My brother gave a toast after that. His was shorter. He'd clearly written it in the car. But he got a big laugh halfway through with a story about my father teaching him to drive, and the room loved him for it. He mentioned me once, a single sentence, and of course, our sister Brooke is here doing her marine thing. Marine thing. The room made a vague appreciative noise, the kind you make when someone mentions something they don't understand but want to seem supportive of. A few people glanced my way. Nobody held the glance. I smiled. I was very good at smiling by then. I'd had years of practice. Here's something people don't understand about being the one who leaves. You think leaving will make things easier. Not easier between you and them, but easier inside yourself. You think that if you go somewhere where your worth is legible, where there's a clear language for what you've done and what it means, you'll stop needing the people who never bothered to learn that language. But you still come home. That's the thing nobody warns you about. You still get in the car and drive 4 hours and press your uniform until it's perfect. You still hope, every single time, that this will be the time it's different, that your father will look at you and see you, that you won't spend the night performing okayness at a table by the kitchen. You still hope. That's the part that costs you. I was on my second club soda, watching the room, when I noticed the man sitting 2 tables to my left. He was older, maybe mid-60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that doesn't come from effort. It's just how some people are built after enough years of holding a particular shape. He was in civilian clothes, a dark blazer and slacks, nothing that announced him. He was sitting with a woman I assumed was his wife and another couple, and he was listening more than he was talking, which already set him apart from most of the room. I didn't recognize him at first. He caught me looking and nodded, the small courteous nod of a stranger at an event, and I nodded back and looked away. It wasn't until he stood to get another drink and I saw how he moved through the room, the way people made space without being asked, the way 2 of my father's old colleagues straightened slightly as he passed, that something started to pull at the edge of my memory. He stopped at the bar and turned, and for a second the light caught his face at a different angle and I felt the recognition land like a hand on my shoulder. Brigadier General Alan Coffey. Retired General Alan Coffey. Retired now, I knew that much. But 11 years ago, before he had that star, he had been Colonel Coffey, and I had served under him for 18 months at a joint training base in North Carolina. He was the kind of officer people told stories about, not the loud, impressive kind of stories, but the quiet ones, the ones passed between junior enlisted when they thought no one was listening. The kind of stories that were really just a way of saying, this is a man you can trust. I had not spoken to him in years. I looked down at my drink. I was trying to decide whether to pretend I hadn't recognized him, which seemed cowardly, or to go over and say something which seemed presumptuous, when I heard a voice just behind my left shoulder. Sergeant Carter? I turned. He was standing 2 feet away, holding a glass of water, looking at me with an expression that was caught between certainty and the particular caution of a man who doesn't want to embarrass someone by being wrong. It's Captain now, sir, I said, and I stood. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of a calculation confirmed. Captain Carter, he said, and he extended his hand. I thought that was you. We shook hands. His grip was the same as I remembered, firm and brief, no performance in it. I didn't know you'd be here, sir, I said. Old Bill and I go back, he said. He meant my father. Bill was what the firehouse called him, almost nobody else did. We were on the same neighborhood emergency response council for years before I retired. Good man. He paused. I didn't know you were his daughter. I am, I said. He looked at me for a moment with the level, particular attention of someone who is actually looking, not just meeting your eyes long enough to be polite. You're sitting all the way back here, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I got in late, I said. Which wasn't true, but it was easier. He glanced at the empty chairs around me, the proximity to the kitchen, Patricia's mother who had fallen asleep with her chin on her chest. He looked back at me. He didn't say anything for a moment. How long have you been at Lejeune? He asked. Going on 4 years. Still with 2nd Marines? 3rd Battalion? He nodded slowly. I heard about the unit commendation last year. 3rd Bat had a good run in that evaluation cycle. I didn't ask how he'd heard. Men like General Coffee heard things. That was part of what they were. The battalion worked hard for it, sir. I imagine they did. He was quiet again for a beat. Then he said, in a tone that was entirely conversational, My wife's been trying to get me to come say hello to some people, but I think I'd rather sit here for a few minutes if you don't mind the company. He sat down. Just like that. Brigadier General, retired, Alan Coffey, who could have been sitting anywhere in that room, who people had been subtly orbiting all night without knowing why, sat down at the kitchen table. We talked for a while. Not about anything dramatic. The changes at Lejeune since he'd last been there, a training evolution that had gone sideways in a way that was funny now even if it hadn't been at the time. The way the Corps had shifted on a few things, whether for better or worse depending on who you asked. He was easy to talk to. He had always been easy to talk to. That was one of the things the stories said. I felt my shoulders come down from somewhere near my ears. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding them there. At some point, my father came over to greet him. He was glad-handing his way through the room by then, the warmth of the evening and a couple of scotches having made him loose and generous with everyone. He saw the general, and his face did the thing. Faces do when they're genuinely pleased. Al, he said. You made it. Wouldn't have missed it, Bill. They shook hands the way men do when they actually mean it. Then my father looked at me, and something flickered across his expression, a brief recalibration, the way you look at a piece of furniture you've walked past 1,000 times and suddenly realize it's in a different room than you thought. You two know each other? He asked. Your daughters served under my command, General Coffey said. He said it the way you'd say a plain fact, not loudly, not pointedly, just clearly. Captain Carter is one of the finest junior officers I worked with in my last decade of service. The room wasn't quiet. The room was still full of the noise of a party, glasses, voices, someone laughing, too loud near the bar. But in the small radius around our table, something changed. My father looked at me. Not the event-appropriate, 3-second look. Not the look you give a parenthesis. A real look. The kind that takes a moment to complete. I didn't know you'd served together, he said. To me or to the general, I wasn't sure. There are probably things you don't know, General Coffey said, and it was so mild and so precise that it took a second for it to land. My father's smile didn't disappear. It just paused, like a clock catching on the second. Later that evening, General Coffey was asked to say a few words. This was my stepmother's idea. She'd found out who he was somewhere around the 3rd hour and had recalibrated her entire social strategy accordingly. She introduced him as one of Bill's dear friends, which was a generous interpretation of a civic committee acquaintance, but nobody corrected her. He stood at the front of the room. He was not a loud man, and he didn't need to be. The room went quiet for him the way rooms do for people who have spent decades being listened to. He talked about my father, about the particular kind of service that doesn't get parades. The slow, grinding, unglamorous commitment of a man who showed up to the same fire station for 3 decades, who went into burning buildings because that was what was asked of him, and he had said yes. He said my father had built something real in this city, and that real things lasted. It was a good speech. And then, near the end, he said this. I was lucky enough to sit tonight with Bill's daughter, Captain Brooke Carter, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. I won't tell you everything she's done, because some of it I'm not at liberty to tell, and the rest of it she'd be embarrassed by. But I'll tell you this. In 27 years of service, I met a handful of people who made me think the institution would be in good hands. She was one of them. He paused. Bill, you raised someone remarkable, in case no one said that clearly enough. The room applauded. My stepmother was smiling with her whole mouth and nothing above it. My brother was looking at me the way you look at someone you've been seeing wrong for a long time and have only just understood it. My father was not smiling at all. He was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not shame, exactly, not quite pride. Something rawer and more complicated than either. Like a man reading a document he should have read years ago. I looked back at him. I held it. I didn't look away. After the applause settled and General Coffee returned to his seat, there was a shift in the room's gravity. People found reasons to come by our table. My father's old colleagues who'd been politely vague with me all evening were suddenly curious, asking real questions, listening to the answers. My stepmother materialized and put her hand on my shoulder with a warmth that had not been there 3 hours ago. I noticed things like that. Near the end of the night, my father sat down next to me. The party was winding down around us. Someone was collecting centerpieces. The bartender was polishing things. My father put his hands around his scotch glass and looked at them for a moment. "You should have told me," he said, "about everything. What you've been doing." I thought about that for a second. "I've been trying to," I said, "for a while." He was quiet. He had the good grace not to argue it. "I know I haven't," he started and then stopped. He's never been good at completing sentences that require him to hold still in a difficult place. "You don't have to do this right now," I told him. "I want to." "I know." I looked at the fire truck centerpiece still sitting between us on the table. "But it's your night. We'll have more time." He nodded. His jaw was tight in the way it gets when he's feeling things he doesn't have words for. "You drive safe going back," he said finally. "I will. 4 hours is a long way." "It's fine," I said. "I've done longer." He looked at me again, that same complicated expression, the one I didn't have a name for. Maybe I'd find one eventually. I hugged him goodbye at the door. It lasted longer than 3 seconds. In the parking lot, General Coffee and his wife were walking to their car. He saw me and raised a hand, a simple, unadorned wave. I raised mine back. I sat in my car for a moment before I started it. The parking lot was mostly empty. The paper banner above the door had come loose on one corner and was curling in the spring air. I thought about my father's face during that speech. The pause where his smile had been. I thought about 11 years of uniform, of early mornings, of decisions made in seconds that you'd spend years afterward measuring against what you knew then and what you learned after. I thought about all the times I'd come home hoping for something I could never quite name and left without it. I thought about the fact that it was my father's party and I had not asked for any of what happened tonight, but it had happened, and he had seen me. Maybe for the first time, maybe not the last. I started the car 4 hours back. Early formation in 2 days. There was a readiness review the week after that, and I had notes to finish and a brief to revise. I had work to do. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove, and the city opened up around me into highway and dark sky, and the particular silence of a night that has given you something you didn't know you were still waiting for. I've thought about that night a lot since it happened. Not obsessively, I'm not that person anymore, the one who replays things looking for a different ending. But I think about it the way you think about something that quietly rearranged something inside you without asking permission first. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nobody rescued me that night. That's not what happened. General Coffee didn't walk into that party and fix my family. My father didn't suddenly become a different man because a retired general said kind words about me over a scotch. My stepmother's hand on my shoulder at the end of the night wasn't some transformation. These things don't work like that. People don't change in one evening over centerpieces shaped like fire trucks. What happened was simpler and in some ways harder to sit with. What happened was that I got seen by someone who had no reason to see me. No social obligation, no family debt to pay. General Coffee sat down at that kitchen table because he chose to. He said what he said because it was true, and because he was a man who believed that true things were worth saying out loud. That was all. And somehow that was everything. I think about what it cost me to keep showing up. Every phone call that didn't get returned. Every drive home that ended with me leaving before I'd gotten what I came for. There's a version of me that stopped going. I almost was that person. I told myself more than once that being invisible to your own family is information, that you should take it and adjust accordingly and stop expecting a different answer from the same equation. But I kept going. And I want to be honest about why. It wasn't wisdom. It wasn't strategy. It was stubbornness mostly. The same stubbornness that got me through boot camp, through deployment, through every moment where the easiest thing would have been to quit and I didn't. At some point, that quality stops being a flaw and starts being the thing that keeps you intact. What I understand now is that integrity isn't just about what you do when people are watching. It's about who you are when no one who matters to you is paying attention. I pressed those dress blues the night before that party in an empty barracks room. Nobody saw that. Nobody was meant to. I did it because it was right, because it was what the occasion deserved, because I am someone who shows up correctly, even when correctly earns me a seat by the kitchen. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole thing. My father and I have talked more in the months since that party than we had in the 2 years before it. It's not easy conversation. We're both people who find feeling things in front of others complicated. But he called me on a Tuesday in October, not for any particular reason, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. He asked about my unit. He asked about my winit. He asked if I was eating enough. He asked what the weather was like at Lejeune. It was the most ordinary phone call I'd ever had with him. I thought about it for a week. The things we build through consistency, through showing up, through doing the work even when the work is invisible, through being who we are even in rooms where nobody knows how to read us. Those things exist whether or not anyone names them. General Coffee named mine that night. But they were already there. They had been there for years. I just had to outlast the silence long enough for someone to say so.